And welcome, everybody. Hands-on Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful Apologetics Dojo. We're kind of switching gears here in the dojo. I'm giving my own presentation. Actually, I was going to do it on Good Friday, but, this is one of those things I think we need to learn, because if we don't understand sacrifice, how are we going to understand Christ's sacrifice or Christ's sacrifice in the Mass? So all of this ties in. So we're going into the basic components, Sacrifice 101. Here on the program, and I said there's two essential elements, where one is essentially you give something over, like signing over the title of a car, making it somebody else's, and that's consecration, where we set a gift or a victim apart for God. And then, of course, you got to give them the keys, right? You got to hand over the gift. So how do you present what is consecrated before the face of God? That's the offering, and those two are necessary. Sometimes communion's necessary, like we just saw with the Passover sacrifice as well. Well, let's talk about the Day of Atonement sacrifice. This is very important to understand. Day of Atonement is very important because, of course, this atones for the sins of Israel. And to put it briefly, basically, you could look at, for example, Leviticus 2, Leviticus 16 as well for the information. Basically, you need to bring a young bullock for the sin offering and a ram for the Holocaust. And also the priest must be dressed in sacred vestments. Of course, we saw Christ actually had a sacred vestment on when he was before he was crucified. And so the consecration, I should say, this making sacred of these animals takes place outside of the tabernacle, outside of the temple. So they're killed outside the temple, and that's the consecration. Okay. Now, the offering is very interesting, because for the Day of Atonement, what happens is this is the one time where somebody actually goes into the most holiest place of the temple, the Holy of Holies, to present these sacrifices before God for the atonement of sins of Israel. This is done by the high priest alone. It's done once a year, like I said, on Yom Kippur or Day of Atonement. And he's to bring blood not only for himself, but also for the people. And just to give you a quick layout of the temple, there's two compartments. There's the holy place and the Holy of Holies. The holy place has the showbread offering, has a menorah, has an altar of incense. And then there's a curtain, okay? And the curtain divides that holy place where a priest can enter from the Holy of Holies. And on the other side with the Holy of Holies, you have the Ark of the Covenant, the propitiatory, and you have the presence of God. Okay, that's where God was present, was in the Holy of Holies. So in Leviticus 2:14 says, so you take some of the bullock's blood and you sprinkle it with his finger and his forepart on the propitiatory, and likewise sprinkle some of the blood with his finger 7 times in front of the propitiatory. So in other words, the high priest enters into the Holy of Holies with the sacrificial blood, and in the Holy of Holies he sprinkles it on the altar. Okay, so God sees the blood of the Day of Atonement sacrifices, and seeing the blood, he either accepts it or rejects it. If he accepts it, the sins are forgiven. I could say a lot about the Holy of Holies. That in itself is very interesting. Well, how in the world does this fit with Jesus' death on the cross? In fact, Jesus' sacrifice as a whole. Well, you have to understand something. When God commanded Moses to make the tabernacle in the desert, and eventually Solomon makes the temple, they both were based on a design that was shown him. In other words, there's a temple in heaven, the true temple in heaven, and the temple here on earth is kind of a finite, limited representation of the temple in heaven. Okay? Very interesting. So God dwells in the Holy of Holies in the temple of heaven, just in a very special way he dwelled in the Holy of Holies on the temple in earth. Okay? So there's kind of like a parallel going on here. Now, Jesus of course, wasn't sacrificed in the sanctuary. He was sacrificed outside the camp, which is precisely where the Day of Atonement sacrifices would be offered or consecrated, excuse me. But, the funny thing is that the Gospels don't mention how Christ offers, if this is the fulfillment of the Day of Atonement sacrifice, how does Christ offer? How does he present himself before the face of God? Well, the Epistle to the Hebrews actually answers this question. And I'm going to read a couple of portions from there because it talks about how Christ fulfills the Day of Atonement sacrifice in heaven. Okay, Hebrews 8. It says, the main point of what I said is this. We have such a high priest who has taken a seat at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle that God, not man, set up. Now each high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus it is necessary for this one also to have something to offer. If then he were on earth, he would not be a priest, since there are those who offer gifts according to the law. They worship in a copy and a shadow of the heavenly sanctuary, as Moses was warned when he was to erect the tabernacle. It says, see that you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. In other words, he's talking about, well, if Jesus was to offer it here on earth, he would have to do it according to the law, right? But there's something greater here than just this shadow and copy of the heavenly sanctuary. There's the actual heavenly sanctuary. So in Hebrews 9 it says, but when Christ came as high priest, remember, only the high priest can enter into the Holy of Holies once a year on the Day of Atonement. Christ is the high priest of the good things that have come to be, passing through the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made by hands, that is, belonging to this creation. He entered once for all into the sanctuary, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of heifers' ashes could sanctify those who are defiled, so their flesh is cleansed, how much more the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciousness from dead works to worship the living God. Okay. So what is it saying now? It's saying that Christ is the high priest and victim who is sacrificed outside the camp, like the bullocks, right? And what is the offering? Because we said if you only have consecration, you don't have the offering, all you have is roadkill, right? It's just an execution. It's turned into a sacrifice by the offering. The offering is Christ enters with his own glorified body that still has his wounds, right? And he goes into the Holy of Holies in heaven, like the high priest does here on earth. But he doesn't come in there with, with blood from sacrificial animals. He comes in with his own blood. In other words, he presents himself before the Father on our behalf, right? And offers himself eternally before the Father. And that is the offering of the Day of Atonement. So Hebrews actually helps us complete that second component. Now, let's see. If I think I probably have enough to tie this into a very, very important thing for our sake. Okay. So what does this mean to us? Well, there is one Christ who is both head and body. So we are members of Christ's body. And being members of Christ, we're one with Christ. And by the way, we're priests. It doesn't matter if you're male or female or what age you are. If you're baptized into what's known as the common priesthood. So that's Catholic doctrine, folks. The common priesthood. You're all priests. And if we're priests, what sacrifice do we offer? Well, Paul helps us in Romans 12. He says, I adjure you, brothers, by the mercy of God, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, which is your logical or reasonable worship. So we're to offer ourselves as sacrifice to God. That is how we worship God. Because, why? Because we're members of Christ's body, the church. Now, what we just learned about what consists in the sacrifice, consecration, and offering, right? You need the two. What is our consecration? Our consecration is obedience, right? God doesn't desire Holocaust and sin offerings. What he desires is obedience, right? We're being united to Christ. Christ lives in us. Through Christ, we are crucified with Christ. We put to death the deeds of the body that we may live. We carry our cross, just like Christ carries his cross, to consecrate ourselves to God. So by doing good works throughout the week, doing holy things, that is our consecration. But now here's the big step, and this is the big apologetic point. How do you present your offerings before God? Do we do it in addition to Christ's eternal offering in heaven? Do we kind of pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps and say, hey, God, look at me. Look at all the good works I did in obedience to you through Christ's grace? No, we don't do it apart from Christ. We do it in, with, and through Christ, one eternal offering in heaven. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why the Eucharist and the sacrifice of the Mass is there. Why? Because that one glorified victim who's in the Holy of Holies presented before God is made present on our altar, and we there at Mass are present in that Holy of Holies in heaven. And that's where we offer all our good works, our suffering, whatever, everything we do for the name of God. We place it on the paten, and the priest, through the hands of the priest, we join in that once-for-all offering that Christ does in heaven. And that's our offering. That's why we're really making sacrifices. That's why we're priests. Okay? So whenever I do this talk, before people, I always say, look, we have a crisis in the priesthood. And no, it's not the abuse scandal. The crisis is with us common priests. Most of us don't even know we're priests. We don't even know that we should be offering our bodies as living sacrifices. We don't know why the Mass is necessary and why the Mass does something that we can't do in our own homes with our private prayer. We need to be present before God, and we can only do that in, with, and through Christ and the Holy Spirit to present ourselves before the Father.